Before oil, empires were built on land, on gold, on bodies. Power was measured in acres conquered, in treasure hoarded, in armies commanded. But in the early 20th century, a new resource emerged on the earth that would rewrite the entire grammar of civilization. Oil, black gold, liquid fire, the blood of the industrial age. It was discovered beneath the deserts of the Middle East, Persia, Arabia, Iraq, places the West had largely ignored, considered barren and irrelevant. But those sands held something more valuable than any mineral. Concentrated ancient sunlight, compressed over millions of years into energy so dense it could power the world. At first, it seemed like a blessing. The British, the Americans, the Dutch, they arrived with contracts and promises. They would drill the oil, refine it, sell it, and share the profits. Everyone would benefit, but the contracts were written in English. The profits were calculated in London and New York, and the oil flowed outward, away from the lands that birthed it, toward the cities that consumed it. The nations sitting on these reserves were paid, but they were paid pennies for treasures worth kingdoms. For decades, this arrangement held. The oil flowed, the West prospered, and the Middle East watched its wealth drain away, extracted by foreign companies operating on their soil, paying taxes to foreign governments, answering to foreign shareholders. But resentment, like oil, builds pressure. By the 1960s, a realization swept across the oil-producing nations. We are sitting on the power, but someone else holds a switch. They had been passive, grateful, compliant. That was about to change. In 1960, 5 nations, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela, formed a pact. They called it the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC. On paper, it was a trade organization. In practice, it was a cartel, a union of sellers who realized that if they coordinated, they could dictate terms. They could control the price. They could control the supply. They could control the world. For over a decade, OPEC was largely symbolic. The Western oil companies still controlled production. Prices remained stable. The system functioned as it always had. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was shifting. In 1973, everything changed. The trigger was a war. Israel and its Arab neighbors clashed in what became known as the Yom Kippur War. The United States supported Israel with weapons and funding. And in response, the Arab members of OPEC made a decision that would shake the global order. They imposed an embargo. No oil would flow to nations supporting Israel. Not to the United States. Not to the Netherlands. Not to anyone who stood against them. Overnight, the supply of oil to the West was cut by 25%. This was not a natural disaster. It was not a market fluctuation. It was a deliberate act of geopolitical warfare. And it worked. Within weeks, gasoline prices quadrupled. Lines at gas stations stretched for miles. Rationing was imposed. The economy convulsed. Industries that depended on cheap energy, which was all of them, ground to a halt. The West, for the first time in generations, was vulnerable, and it had been made vulnerable not by armies, but by a turn valve. OPEC had discovered something extraordinary. Oil was more than a commodity. It was leverage. It was a weapon. And unlike bombs or bullets, it could be deployed without firing a shot. The embargo lasted only 6 months, but its effects were permanent. When the oil began flowing again, the price had risen from $3 per barrel to $12, a 300% increase in less than a year. The producing nations had quadrupled their revenue without extracting a single additional drop. They had simply changed the rules. And the world, desperate and dependent, paid the price. But the story didn't end with higher prices. It evolved into something far more sophisticated. In the years following the embargo, a new arrangement was born, one that would bind the fate of oil to the fate of the dollar itself. It was called the Petrodollar system. The Petrodollar was a stroke of genius and a Faustian bargain. Here's how it worked. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations agreed to sell their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. No other currency would be accepted. If Europe wanted oil, they had to buy dollars first. If Japan wanted oil, they needed dollars. If anyone wanted energy, they needed American currency. In exchange, the United States offered military protection, arms deals, security guarantees, the full weight of American power, ensuring the survival of these regimes. This arrangement did something remarkable. It made the dollar indispensable. Even after Nixon severed the dollar's tie to gold in 1971, the currency didn't collapse. Why? Because it was now tied to something arguably more essential than gold, energy itself. Every nation needed oil. Therefore, every nation needed dollars. The dollar became the global reserve currency not because it was backed by metal, but because it was backed by the singular resource that powered modern civilization. OPEC had won control of the price, but America had won control of the system. It was a perfect symbiosis and a perfect trap. The producing nations became fabulously wealthy. Petrodollars flooded into their treasuries. Skyscrapers rose from the desert. Cities were built overnight. Sovereign wealth funds accumulated trillions. But that wealth was denominated in dollars, invested in Western banks, tied to Western markets. They had gained influence, but they had not gained independence. And independence, as history shows, is the only power that truly matters. Meanwhile, the rest of the world adapted to the new reality. Oil was no longer just an energy source. It was a foundation of geopolitics. Wars were fought over it. Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, not for ideology, but for oil fields. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003, officially for weapons, but the oil was never far from the calculation. Entire foreign policies were constructed around maintaining access to Middle Eastern crude. Dictators were supported. Revolutions were crushed. Democracies were overthrown. Because in the end, the men who sold the sun weren't just selling energy. They were selling the one thing every civilization needs to survive: power itself. And power, once concentrated, is never willingly shared. Here's what they don't tell you in economics textbooks. Oil is finite. Everyone knows this. But the system is designed to pretend it isn't. The entire global economy is built on the assumption that cheap energy will always be available, that there will always be another barrel to extract, another field to discover, another way to keep the engines running. But geology doesn't care about assumptions. Peak oil, the point at which extraction reaches its maximum and begins to decline, is not a conspiracy theory. It's a mathematical certainty. The only question is when. Some say we've already passed it. Others say we have decades left. But the direction is inevitable. Down. And as supply tightens, the men who control what remains will hold power unlike anything seen before. This is why every major power is obsessed with securing energy reserves. Why Russia invades neighbors with natural gas. Why China builds solar farms and nuclear plants at breakneck speed. Why the United States maintains military bases across the Middle East. They all see the same horizon, and they're all racing to be on the right side of it when the music stops. But here's the deeper truth, the one that cuts through all the geopolitics and strategy. The real power was never in the oil itself. It was in the dependency on oil. The men who sold the sun didn't just sell a product. They sold a system, a civilization-wide addiction. And once the world was hooked, the price became negotiable only by the dealers. This is why alternative energy terrifies certain interests. Not because it doesn't work, but because it threatens a dependency. Solar panels don't need OPEC. Wind turbines don't require embargoes. Once energy becomes decentralized, the leverage evaporates. And those who built their empires on that leverage will do anything to preserve it. That's not paranoia. That's economics. The oil age is ending. Not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably. The question is not if, but how. Will it end through innovation and transition, or through collapse and conflict? The men who sold the sun knew this from the beginning. They knew the oil wouldn't last forever. But they built the system anyway, because their power didn't depend on the oil lasting. It depended on controlling it while it did. And control, once established, finds new forms. Today, the same dynamics are playing out with lithium, cobalt, rare earth minerals, the resources needed for batteries and electronics, different materials. Same game. Whoever controls the inputs controls the outputs. Whoever controls energy controls civilization. This has been true since humans discovered fire. It was true when empires ran on coal. It was true when they ran on oil. And it will be true for whatever comes next. The legacy of the petrodollar era is not the wealth it created. It's the lesson it taught. Energy is not just power. It's the shadow behind every throne. Wars aren't fought over land anymore. They're fought over the resources beneath it. Diplomacy isn't about ideology. It's about supply chains. Freedom in the modern world is measured not in rights, but in kilowatts. The men who sold the sun are still among us. They've changed names, changed companies, changed narratives. But the core transaction remains the same. Sell dependency. Call it progress. Profit from the difference. And the world, desperate for the light, keeps buying. One day, perhaps, humanity will find a way to decouple power from control, to generate energy without creating masters. But until that day comes, we remain what we've always been, buyers in a market we didn't choose, dependent on a sun we don't own. The men who sold the sun didn't sell energy. They sold dependency, and the world has been paying for it ever since.
If you've made it this far, you're no longer a spectator. You're a witness. Subscribe to see what comes next. Like to mark your place in the ledger. Share to awaken another. The machine notices those who pay attention.